Shall we start? Oh God, this is quite loud. Yeah, thanks. Maybe I talk.
Test.
Okay. So welcome to this next session with Beirut Urban Lab and Professor Mona Harb. My name is Louise Taylor, and I am a newly minted Cities MA graduate, and I will be hosting this session. So, by way of introduction, I just wanted to give you a little background to how we found ourselves here today. Throughout the course of MA Cities, we explore questions that the city asks of us. How we might intervene in current city-making practices, and how can we create new ones? But when I came to MA Cities, it was very clear that I wanted to respond to questions that the city of Beirut was asking. Very early on in this process of inquiry, I came across Beirut Urban Lab because, in fact, every time I was asking a question about the city, there was the work of Beirut Urban Lab. And so fast forward 2 very fruitful years later, I was fortunate enough to work with Professor Harb on the field research portion of my thesis. The collaboration with Beirut Urban Lab was essential, not only because my thesis was very much rooted in the theoretical foundations of Beirut Urban Lab, but also because I felt it was monumentally important that it be constructed in conversation with voices from the city. I ended up by iterating on Beirut Urban Lab's work on urban vacancies with sensory and activity mapping in order to see what story could be told by the multiple layers of data and how this story could guide interventions or commissions on the rehabilitation of vacant space. This ultimately with an eye towards larger questions like what role does public space play in Beirut as a vessel for collective life, but also how could we get really specific about the small shifts and additions that could facilitate both. So fast forward even further to today, we have the exciting opportunity to engage with one of the preeminent voices producing scholarship from and on the city. Please welcome Professor Mona Harb. So just by a little bit of an introduction, she is the co-founder and research lead of Beirut Urban Lab. In addition to her work with Beirut Urban Lab, she is a tenured professor in urban studies and politics at American University of Beirut. Her research investigates urban governance and city-making contexts of dysfunctional states and disasters, and the role of urban activists in collective action and oppositional politics. So with this, over to you, Mona.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thanks for coming and thanks very much for having me. It's a very happy coincidence that I'm here and my body's here, not only my face over Zoom. I was giving a talk yesterday at UCL about my research, but today I'm going to share with you some information about the Beirut Urban Lab. I'm very happy to do that and to introduce you to the work we've been doing. I've selected to do more of a, what do you call it, like an overview of the various initiatives and projects we're engaged in, rather than a deep dive in one of them. But I'll be very happy to deep dive in any of them if you're particularly interested in one or the other. So the Beirut Urban Lab is a lab. It's a lab that deals with cities, as the name indicates, and it's located in Beirut. It doesn't only work in Beirut, and as I'll explain in a second, we see ourselves as a place that thinks also about Global South urban transformations and urbanization. So we're part of the American University of Beirut, specifically of the Faculty of Engineering and Architecture. We're still a school that combines these two disciplines, a very archaic structure. But we have autonomy as a school of architecture and design, and in our school we have a program in architecture, in graphic design, and graduate programs in urban planning and urban design, which I'm currently coordinating. So I'm trained as an architect. I should say a few words about myself. I'm trained as an architect and as an urbanist, not an urban planner, not an urban designer. And my PhD is in political science. So my entry point to the urban is more through my interest in urban politics, actors, governance processes, who makes the city, who produces the city. Yes. Yeah, but I think, yes. Okay, so some background about our lab. So we established the lab in 2018 thanks to a grant from the Ford Foundation that helped us institutionalize efforts that were actually active prior to 2018. We're 4 core directors, myself, Mona Fawaz, my colleague, you see her here, Huwaida Al-Harithi, my other colleague, and Ahmed Gharbiye. So we're 4 co-directors. It's a very horizontal structure. We have a team of researchers and staff. It's a small but mighty team. We always like to call it small and mighty. So we are a team of about 10 to 15 researchers and staff. It fluctuates, like Lebanon, with depending on what's happening. People leave, people come, and people get associated. We work with our graduate students as well, who become our thesis advisees and who take part in our projects. And we always have some programs that engage with interns. So we're a research space that is interdisciplinary, as good critical urbanists, I would say. We do a lot of collaborative work, and we produce scholarship on the urbanization and the transformation processes in Lebanon and on its regions, both natural and the built environment. And we are mainly interlocutors with a variety of actors, academic, professional, policy. And our main aim, we have a very clear and strong positionality, which is to advance viable, just, and equal cities, and to promote social justice through the work we do. So we collaborate a lot with activists, citizens, professionals, private sector, who are like-minded people who are struggling to advance these issues in a country where they're not values that are predominant. So we try to teach them, advocate for them, lobby for them, and make them happen, at least discursively, if not in practice. Yeah, a few words about the images you see here, just to also give you a sense of the legacies we've been producing that you can also discover through our website. We've worked on advocating for the public domain, for public life, for the public sphere, and we published these newspapers that you see there about the public, about city and its security at a moment in time where Beirut was very much governed by security networks that prevented a lot the mobility of its citizens. So we take issues that are very salient at the time and we reflect on them through with our students, with our colleagues, with invited collaborators, and we publish them in platforms that are accessible to a wider public. That was before open access, actually, these newspapers. We also do more academic outputs, like the book you see here, both books that were published by my colleagues, Huwaida Al-Harithi and Mona Fawaz, on the reconstruction of Harb Tahrik after the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon, and also the book on lessons in post-war reconstruction that was also an output of the experiences we had supporting the post-war reconstruction of 2006. Remember, Lebanon is a place where we always have conflict, tensions, disasters happening, so we are also always reflecting on these things that happen. We also edited a volume on refugees after the Syrian refugee crisis took place that is also available in open access. So we pilot 4 research tracks. Each one of us is the point person for one, but of course these tracks intersect with each other and we work a lot collaboratively as well. So the social value of land is a research track that is coordinated by Mona Fawaz. Planning, actors and scale, or governance and institutions is the track I'm more responsible of. Urban recovery is what Huwaida Al-Harithi, my colleague, does, and critical mapping is cuts across all the tracks, and this is what Ahmed Gharbiye coordinates with the visualization and the GIS unit we have at the lab. So we've been producing evidence-based knowledge. We also produce increasingly over the past year knowledge-based platforms and open access. Some of them are interactive as well. And we do a lot of policy advocacy and outreach with public actors, international actors, local municipalities, academics, students, PhDs, postdocs, whoever is interested in working on the urban in Beirut comes through the Beirut Urban Lab, and we find ways to work together or to associate them to what we do or to host them or to engage them in our reflections. So this is, I'm not going to go through all this. I'm going to share with you some of the projects we've been doing over the past years, and I'll be happy to come back to any of them in the discussion. So yes, it's important to note that we do co-produced knowledge and collaborative knowledge, so we work very closely with the communities, with the actors that we're reflecting with. We try to hire them as citizen scientists in our projects, even as skilled labor when there are possibilities to do that, and when there are funds to do that as well. And these are some images of the type of engagement we do at the lab. This is an image of the lab at AUB, or in the streets and in public gardens. So it all started with our urge to create the base map of Beirut. It's important to say that we live in a city where there's no data on the urban, on cities of Lebanon, and specifically on Beirut. So as educators, as activists, we became very frustrated with not even having a base map of the city that documents what the city is about, and that we always had to borrow AutoCAD files of the Beirut map to try to work with. So when we got the grant from the Ford Foundation, the main project upon which we wanted to work was to produce a clean base map of the city of Beirut with multiple layers on GIS that we could put in open access for everyone to be able to access that knowledge and produce further knowledge about the urban and the city. So we started with collecting series of maps that existed in various public and private sites, and we overlaid them on GIS, and we produced the first layers. We hired also a lot of surveyors to go down to the city and survey the areas that weren't clear, where we had a lot of lines over each other or whites on the map, and we wanted to fill these whites. We also had a partnership with the Order of Engineers and Architects, and they accepted to share with us their archive of building permits of the city of Beirut over 25 years. So we were able to actually produce knowledge about who built Beirut based on the analysis of these building permits. It took about 2 years to be able to, and a lot of pain and a lot of corrections. I'm skipping this, but I mean, we can spend the whole presentation just talking about the production of that base map. We used to do that in the beginning. Now we're like just taking it for granted, but it was a lot of labor. Ultimately, we were able to put online the base map of the city, and it can be downloaded with its key layers by anyone working on Beirut today. And this was the main project of the lab, is to produce this map and give students, researchers, activists, public policymakers access to a clean map using these layers that they could share, and where they could give back as well to the lab, where we can concentrate this. So this is mainly because we don't have a municipality that has a city planning unit. So in many ways we operated and did that because we're going to be the shadow municipality, waiting that we can actually have a planning unit in our municipality, which can probably, I don't know if it will happen in my lifetime, but if ever. It was also after an experience we had where we waged the municipal campaign in 2016 that was under the name of Beirut Madinati, Beirut My City, where we supported electoralists to try to take the municipality and to actually do the planning unit inside the municipality, but we didn't manage to take the municipality, although we did a very decent score in the elections. But that's a long story that I'll be happy to share if you're interested in municipalism and municipal activism, now or later.
Maybe 5 minutes now,
yeah?
3 minutes, I'd love to. Yeah.
Okay, so this is 2016. were a bunch of academics and political activists, economic activists, urban activists having dinner at Munafawa's actually house. And municipal elections were about to happen in 8 months. And we were very upset with the current municipal council that does nothing for the city. And we had this crazy idea about like, let's run for elections and build a list. And we're like, do we do this? Don't we do this? How can we do that? And the question was like, okay, who would run? Who will be the mayor? How can we build a list of 24 candidates? And around dinner, we were like 15, 20 people. The question was like, okay, who can vote in Beirut? Because I don't know how many of you are familiar with Lebanon, but we vote where our grandparents were born. And it's a strategy of the sectarian system to make sure that you don't vote where you live, because it will explode the demography of Lebanon and all the sectarian political system. God forbid, we should not do that. We want to make sure that the sectarian system reproduces itself. So around the table, nobody was from Beirut. Everyone was from other towns and other cities. And still, we felt like we wanted to try this out. There was a crazy moment where we said, like, let's try to do this. And we convened as a campaign with other activists. We formed like committees. Everybody was in charge of something. I was in charge of putting together the candidates and finding candidates that fit sectarian affiliations, but also expertise. And we were run for the first time in the political history of Lebanon with a list of 24 candidates, half women, half men, who looked pretty much like us here, very different than the political establishment that rules the country. And we had a score of 30% in the elections, but because we don't have proportional representation, we couldn't have any seat in the municipality. Still, it allowed us to politicize ourselves further, to learn a lot of things about mobilization. One of actually the candidate that ran for mayorship is today an MP. He was a student actually of our program. Brahim Naimne, if anybody's here interested in getting to know him. So somewhere there are little tiny steps of change that keep happening in this country against 1 million odd, with a lot of regression as well, but we try to hang to these little steps that move forward, or else we would just like leave, and a lot of people leave actually. And it's fine. There will be a cycle where they'll come back. It's like that in this part of the world. We move back to the base map. So at the time we wanted to do a planning unit in the municipality, and we wanted to do the base map and all that, but after the failure of taking the municipality, we said, okay, we'll just do a shadow municipality at AUB. And AUB is an interesting institution that gives a lot of flexibility for its university professors to be activists. It's part of its history. It's a place where a lot of activists graduated. Some of them became politicians, others became opposition activists. So it's a wide spectrum, but it gives that freedom for professors to also play a role in political life. So we established the lab, and that allowed us to produce maps like I'm going to show you. This is one where we integrated the data on the building permits, and that showed us how Beirut, this is the map of Beirut, what you see in blue, for those who know the city, is the seaside Corniche. The downtown of Beirut, let me do a little bit of professorship thing. So this is the downtown of Beirut. So the Solidaire project is here. This is all reclaimed land on the sea. The demarcation line of the city runs like this. So this is the western part of the city, more cosmopolitan, with a mixity of predominant leftist groups and more of a Muslim-dominant population. Here is more the Christian part of the city. This is the river, and this is the big triangle, is the biggest public park we have, which also has an interesting history. The airport is somewhere here. The city has grown way beyond its municipal borders that you see here, but we concentrate presently on the municipal part because this is what we have data on, but we'd love to expand that map in the future. Hopefully with the students we'll be able to do that. So this map actually shows you how class is a layer that is very important in Beirut. We always talk about Muslims and Christians in Beirut, but we don't talk a lot about poor and rich. So this is a map that shows you the high-end developments in red in the city, and the buildings that took, or the households actually that took loans from the public agency that gives subsidies to get affordable housing. So we use it as a proxy to read who is middle class and who are the rich, or who are the lower middle class and who are the rich. And you can see how the city is quite segmented, not only in terms of sectarian division, but also in terms of class and higher income, lower income people, with the lower income classes concentrating in these areas in yellow, and what you see in red being more the richer part of the city along downtown Beirut, the seaside. What's interesting about this is when you intersect it with this map, and when you see the square meters of the apartments being provided. Sorry, this is a bit cut, but I'll read it for you. So in the data set we have, we were able to show that only 17% of this built fabric, I mean not only, we have close to 20% of the built fabric that provides apartments that are larger than 300 square meters, very big apartments that are affordable for the few. And more than half of these apartments were empty in our survey. So we have very high rates of vacancy in the city, which also gives us a very strong indicator about who lives in the city and who doesn't, and who is the city for, who are these apartments for. We also drew this graph of the supply of apartments in the period you see from 1996 to 2018, so you can see the peaks of real estate speculation and development, and how it indicates the collapse we're actually living currently in Lebanon. And you see that the smaller apartments, which are in blue, they form about 20% of the provided building supply, and very few people are able to afford them. Their cost is more than 900 times the lowest wage in the city, and that was in 2018. Things are much worse now. So you see how through these maps we're able to tell a lot of stories about the city. I'm just sharing with you a few, but we can talk about them more if you're interested. These are the rates of vacancy across the city that average about 25% throughout and reach 40 and 50% in downtown Beirut. Also to give you an idea about how the city is, a lot of this building supply is empty, and it's a lot, what Mona Fawaz calls them, like safe deposit boxes, where you're mainly hiding your capital or safeguarding your capital in these big apartments, but you don't use them. Another project we were involved in is the advocacy for inclusive and open public spaces. So in a city that's dominated by this very dense built environment that is private, how can we expand the public sphere, the public domain? How can we make people interact with each other more and create a sense of belonging and citizenship that can transcend the divides of a polarized city? So these are the maps that attracted Louise to the Urban Lab. So these are maps that where we documented the sites that were publicly owned, to highlight the fact that the state does own public land and that we have a lot of municipal open and public space, but that it is restricted of use and of access, and that we as activists who are interested in social justice and spatial justice can do a lot by reclaiming these spaces. So by putting them on a map, we were also sending this message to students, to activists, telling them these are the spaces you can reclaim in your own neighborhoods if you want to squat them, to claim them, to use them. These are public spaces, you're paying for them, they're abandoned, you can fix them. So we were very inspired by guerrilla urbanism, tactical urbanism, all these approaches to reclaiming public space. What we also documented is the vacant, unbuildable parcels in municipal Beirut. So we got a hold on a list that was shared in secrecy by someone who got it from the municipality, which listed all the unbuildable lots in the city and the vacant lots in the city, and we were able to put them on a map. We were not sure about the data, but still for us it was an interesting list to map and to share with everyone, with that same spirit of telling people there are unbuildable lots in the cities like this one you see here. Some people are taking them and making them like private little gardens for them. They have coffee there with their neighbors. If you pass by, you can come in and visit them and have a nice conversation with the person in charge of them. Some are completely empty and unused, but they can be transformed in pocket gardens, in little spaces that can do a lot of difference in the city. I have a lot of photos, but I didn't bring them to this. Again, it's hard to think what to present and what to choose, so I chose to go more like a sweeping presentation. Actually, if you read the thesis of Louise, you'll get an idea about much more of these spaces, because she worked on these vacancies and these unbuildable lots and how to leverage them to make a more inclusive and diverse space. And you have some of her stuff there. So that's a good segue to advertise for your work. So this is also the type of work we do. We took two neighborhoods in the city next to the Corniche, where we documented all the unbuildable lots, the vacant spaces, the public lots, but also the abandoned buildings, to try to come up with a methodology of intervention. If we were, a municipal councillor and we were assigned to do the job of reactivating the city through its vacancies, how we would go about it. So we documented through a photographic series of small essays these sites, these vacancies, the people who live there, so that would inspire interventions that would respond to the needs of these sites. We also worked on Beirut's public coast within the same framework to protect the coast from further privatization and encroachment. We have a lot of encroachment on the public coast of the city, and we came up with an alternative regulation proposal to protect what's left of it, that we submitted to the municipality of Beirut, hoping that they would legislate for it. Of course they didn't, not yet, but I mean what we do is also prepare these draft laws, awaiting the right moment for them to have a policy window where we can put them forward once we have people in the municipality or in parliament that would be able to push for them. And we make a lot of noise about the necessity to do this and tell people that there are ways to produce a better city, a more inclusive city. It's actually quite easy to do. It's not very difficult to find solutions for this. It's not a technical problem, in other words, because there's always the issue is we cannot do it, nothing can be done, it's so difficult. And what we try to say, it's not difficult. If you want to do it, you can do it. It's about deciding to do it. It's deciding to do people-centered policies, not profit-centered policies. So that discourse is something we keep on repeating in every meeting, in every academic meeting, intellectual meeting, policy meeting, and it's a bit, at the end you feel like it's a bit absurd to keep repeating it, because very few of it happens, but I think there are some instances where we see the resonance of this, especially with the younger generations. We also worked, I particularly worked on this project. This was identification of all the advocacy movements that were trying to advance rights to the city in Beirut, where we published research on the activists in Beirut that were trying to reclaim public land, that reopened the big public park I showed you earlier in the map, that prevented private developments from happening on the coast. Sometimes in Beirut, the best you can do is prevent a project from happening rather than making a project that is inclusive and open happen. So a lot of campaigns are about denouncing the privatization and saying this should not go through, and making a lot of noise to prevent it from happening. We also did comparative work with other urban activists in Egypt and Tunisia. These were the beginning of the hopes of the Arab Spring before all the the repressions happened in Egypt, now in Tunis, and it was a moment where we were trying to network and intersect our initiatives with other urban activists elsewhere and learn from each other. So actually, when these maps that I showed you here were produced, we were supposed to exhibit them in this annual conference we do at EUB called City Debates, but then the pandemic hit Beirut and we canceled the conference. And we started being interested in that pandemic and what was happening as a response. So while we were sitting at home to prevent ourselves from going crazy, I started working with the researchers who were working with me on documenting who was responding to the pandemic in Lebanon, what type of responses they were doing, how much of these responses were sectarian and how much were non-sectarian. And we did a huge Excel sheet listing every response according to a certain logic and documenting who was establishing quarantine center, who was providing hygiene kits, who was doing prevention campaigns, who was doing curfews, who was preventing people from walking on the street, which type of people. And after the Excel was finished, we put it on GIS, on ArcGIS, and we produced this map that allowed us to extract these two maps of what we call the political parties' responses by location. So you see here all the political parties in Lebanon, how they very quickly leveraged the pandemic. I call it in a paper I published with the Middle East Law and Governance that the virus came to their rescue. So it helped them very much reposition themselves as dominant hegemonic actors because they locked the country, they imposed curfews and emergency laws, and then they started distributing services that were supposed to help people and captured again their constituents through this service provision. It's a strategy that's very commonly used, not only in Lebanon, in any country that has clientelistic, corporatist type of political systems. We contrasted that with the response of non-sectarian groups that were quite active as well, that had a more of a solidarity and mutual aid logic in their responses and their provision of goods and services. And what you see in the pies here, so in red you see the sectarian response, and in blue you see the non-sectarian response. And roughly it's a 2/3, 1/3 proportion. And for us, we were trying to show as well that in Lebanon, you always have this tension between the hegemonic groups that are advancing these sectarian clientelistic ideals versus opposition groups that are always trying to mobilize against it and that exist. So there's a glass ceiling of 30% that we are unable to crack for some reason, but it is there, and I think it's also important to be aware of these realities. So it also inspired us to keep the struggle. I mean, we always remember that the revolution doesn't happen, and it's a matter of a very long scale, it's a very long journey, so it's not a matter of 5 and 10 years, it's a matter that would take decades, much more. But so it's a long journey that needs to start and continue. On August 2020, on 4th of August 2020, there was a huge explosion that destroyed 1/3 of the city of Beirut that happened in the port. So after that disaster, which is a man-made disaster that's due to the criminal negligence of our ruling class, we mobilized again at the Beirut Urban Lab, and I say again because that was the second mobilization after a war. I mean, in 2006 it was a war, now it was a disaster, but it was another mobilization to rebuild and recover. And at the time, I mean, I still sigh when I speak about this, because when you've done it once and doing it again after 15 years, you really need to find a lot of strength and courage to just like stand on your feet and say like, another episode of reconstruction, another episode of training students on what is recovery, what is reconstruction, although we don't feel like doing reconstruction and recovery, and we're not resilient enough to do this as usually it's portrayed always like, oh, you're so resilient, you always are doing recovery and reconstruction. It's not like we want to. So this started just in the aftermath of the blast, maybe like we went and picked the broken glass in the lab because the glass was shattered in the lab at AUB, like in many places in Beirut that were very far from the blast. Some of our homes were also destroyed by the blast, but thankfully nobody was hurt, but we knew many of the victims, and many of our colleagues and friends lived in the neighborhoods affected by the blast, so it wasn't easy to pick ourselves up and to work on this, but we did. So we took the base map that we produced in the lab and shared it with dozens of actors and told them, that's the base map. Please work on this basis so we can share together the data we are going to start to collect. And we cooperated with Rice University in the US, which was starting to map the damages using satellite imagery. And they're amazing resources that we didn't have access to. And we produced this first map of damages together that we gave to all the international non-governmental organizations, to international organizations, to the municipality, to the army, to whoever wanted it. We were walking around with USBs and CDs and just giving them the map and the map of damages so they can build up a response that made sense and that was grounded in evidence-based knowledge. That was possible thanks to the fact that we had a base map. So it was the first time where we felt like what we did was useful for a post-disaster response and disaster recovery. A few months later, we established the Beirut Urban Observatory, which is an open access platform of the urban data that is informing the post-blast recovery efforts. So we produced a map that with the NGOs who agreed to share with us their data sets, where you can see how many homes were repaired after the blast, who repaired them and where. So these are data sets of 23 NGO and INGO that agreed to share their data set. In total, we estimate there are about 60. So it's about 40% of the response. So it gives us a pretty good idea how the home repairs were done and where and who did what. So you can click on each building and have an idea about the number of floors, who did it, how many actors were involved in the rebuilding. So it's a great data that can also be used by students who want to reflect further on the recovery efforts. We also mapped the businesses that were closed and open along the main commercial arteries. The places that were hit by the blast were really among the heart of, parts of the center of Beirut, the peri-center. This is where the nightlife happened. This is where the creative cultural industries were located. The designers, the artists were all in these areas. So we mapped we had information about these places from prior work because it's a part of the city that was well documented by previous work done by colleagues. So we were able to know, we knew what was there before the blast. So we used this data to also see what was closed and what reopened 3 months into the blast, 6 months into the blast, 9 months into the blast, and we were able to document the progressive return of life, what we called return of life. We spent hours debating if it's a return or not, if it's life or not, but I'll spare you. But it was... Sure. So I can drink a bit of water and... Yes? I go? Thank you. Okay, so mapping of the commercial life industries too. So we do this mainly because we wanted to advance an understanding of urban recovery that is integrated. So it's not only about the physical repairs of homes. So we kept on saying that it's not enough that NGOs just repair homes, that they needed to also repair businesses, and that they needed to invest in open spaces. That for a neighborhood to recover, it needed to be, the repairs needed to happen across the commercial, the urban, the housing, and the public space spheres. I think it was an interesting experience because NGOs and INGOs and even faith-based organizations responded well to our pleas. I mean, we were several actors advocating for this. This is a map that documents the open spaces and community projects that happened after the blast. And there, again, it's an open access, so you can really zoom in and get to see who did what where and what type of interventions happened. We also documented who returned after the blast. So to do that, because that was a very large scope to do that, we selected 8 clusters. We are showing only 6 here, but we added 2 at a later stage where we surveyed everyone who lived there, who worked there, or even the houses that were closed. We tried to ask questions about who owns them, where are the people, to give us an idea about who returned and who didn't. And we were able to identify a lot of precarity, a lot of exclusion, a lot of eviction threats that gave us information also about the darker side of recovery that we were not seeing through the other maps. So this led eventually to an open access platform called Precarious Life that I'm not showing here, but that exists on the website that dives deeper into precarity in Beirut in the aftermath of the blast, but also of the economic and financial crisis that deprived people of their savings and of their and that devaluated the Lebanese pound, and that makes more than 80% of the Lebanese population today live under the poverty line. So just to make sure that, you know, we don't see, because the map also is sends this message that things are good, things are rosy, it's a colorful, pretty map, but it's not as colorful and pretty in real life. So the Precarious Life platform is something I should have probably brought it here. Now that I'm presenting it, I think it should be added to the presentation. It's okay. We worked a lot on the cultural and urban heritage. This is a part of the city that includes the richest urban heritage of Beirut. Beirut is a very old city with a lot of urban heritage that dates to the Ottoman period, the French Mandate period, and to the modern heritage period. So to be able to know what is there that needs to be recovered and protected, Huwaid Al-Harithi, my colleague, worked with the UNESCO on a very thorough report documenting the urban heritage in the areas affected by the blast. That's the port that you see here, up there, so just below the port. And she used an approach that documents not only the built heritage, but also the landscape heritage. This is an area very rich with ecology and greenery. So we were able to recommend that clusters of built and natural heritage would be preserved in the response. Hopefully, I mean, this requires a lot of funds. There are no funds. Crises and disasters are happening everywhere. Funds have shifted to Ukraine after the blast now, and then they moved to Pakistan. Now they're in Sudan. Where else? I mean, everybody needs funds. Everybody's in crisis. Disasters are populating the earth, so it's not easy to find funds to do this type of work. But maybe it will happen. At least it's documented what needs to be done. We also dream a lot in the lab as designers and urbanists who believe in the power of utopias and of political imaginaries. We spend a lot of time doing what we call prefigurative exercises with our students and our colleagues. So we spend a lot of time thinking how best to rebuild, even if the odds are against us. If we were to dream about what to do in this recovery, if there's an opportunity in the recovery phase, what would we want for the city of Beirut? And so we used a lot of the prior work that were done by colleagues, the late Habib Dibes, the late Robert Saliba. We lost 2 very precious colleagues this year, unfortunately, to cancer. So before they passed, we worked with them and with other colleagues on visioning an urban vision for the city that would reconnect the divided city of Beirut with its port and with the downtown, which is now a ghost town that is empty of any life. How to revive a downtown that was completely gentrified and neoliberalized after the Civil War reconstruction, now that the city is impoverished and there's a dysfunctional state that is doing practically nothing on purpose. How we can rethink about recovering the city as collectives, as universities, as NGOs, as INGOs who are interested in recovering the city. So we produced this map. I'll talk about it a little bit because I have some images that will go in detail. So the idea, this is where the blast happened, and in this site, these are the silos. So the idea is to reclaim all the seafront of Beirut that detach the city from the port, and to reconnect the city to the river, to the seaside, to reclaim the open lands that are not the public areas of, this is the waterfront park that was supposed to be developed by Solidaire, that is now like a terrain vague. If you go to Beirut, it's a very active public space. A lot of people go walk there. So it's a very active park, but it has no amenities, no facilities, no shading, no greenery, no anything. So it's a huge potential for the city that can connect the seaside corniche, which is our main public space, with downtown Beirut, with all the areas that were affected by the blast, where you have the nightlife and the commercial life, with the northern suburb as well. This is Burj Hamoud, the Armenian area. There's a landfill reclamation project that's supposed to happen here. This is the garbage dump that happened during the Civil War, which needs to be reclaimed. And this is the basins that were reclaimed by the port, but there are real opportunities to connect to an estuary park here, and to reconnect also what happens in this part of the city with the lower part. This was divided by a highway. This is a train station that is abandoned that can be also repurposed and regenerated into part of this network. So I will focus on two pilot projects we're advocating for: Al-Masar al-Akhdar, the green spine, and the coastal spine that we're proposing to push for, and that we're trying to quote-unquote sell to the international organizations so they can fund them. So this is the coastline of Karantina that I showed you earlier, that we've drawn in detail and that we suggest that can be reclaimed. This is Al-Masar al-Akhdar, which is an old project since the 2000 that was put forth by the urban preservationist of Beirut, that we revived with Habib Dibas before he passed, and that we are starting through a logic of what we're calling micro-projects or micro-urbanism to put together through very tiny interventions, and even these tiny interventions are being fought by everyone. So it's tiring, but it's like at least there's a strategy that we're trying to push, and we're hoping that maybe they fight this first intervention and they'll let us work with the rest when we can. So these are the types of drawings we're trying to produce to persuade the municipality, the governor, the international organization that there's a real possibility to rebuild the city through these micro-urbanism projects. So this is what exists, and this is what it could be like. This is an area that's full with public staircases, with a very live and vibrant public. People use the street a lot. It's a human scale. It's a beautiful heritage. This is where we go and walk when we're in the city during weekends. If you visit, this is where you'd like to go and experience what is Beirut about. This is where we take our friends, our colleagues, our family when they visit us. This is where we go have drinks at night. And this is where festivals, concerts, and exhibitions happen in the streets, inside these little boutiques that exist and that can be also revived. This is a project that is sponsored by the Beirut Urban Lab that uses money that we received from the Lebanese diaspora after the blast, that was fundraised in the US by a collective of designers called Design Miami, who asked us to invest it in a reconstruction project. So we're designing this ghulam piazza or square, which is just a part of the, this is actually, sorry. This is actually, where are we? This is actually just at the end of this drawing here. So it's a strategic spot of the green spine that allows us to link the neighborhoods together. The works of this are happening as we speak. They were stopped by a political sectarian party 2 weeks ago, and we were trying to negotiate with them to let us do it. They want to park 2 more cars because we removed the cars 100 feet away from the sidewalk. So we're fighting about where to park their cars, but hopefully it will come through. I can talk more about this if you want. This was designed also by the late Habib Debus. We're also doing an open space network in the Karantina neighborhood, which is just next to the port, which is a very vulnerable neighborhood in the city, very invisibilized over time. This is the workers' neighborhoods. This is where the most vulnerable groups and laborers live. So it was much easier to work there because the stakes were lower. So there we were able to hire citizens and dwellers and involve them in the actual building of the open space network. So these are the before-after pictures. You see the type of upgrading we managed to do, the creation of sidewalks, of green spaces, of murals, of seating areas for the people who live in the neighborhood, and some playgrounds for the children. I didn't get that, or you'll see a picture in a bit. This was documented as well in reports. If you're interested in getting to know the process through which we've done this, it's all available on the Beirut Urban Lab website. I end with my own research. This is what I presented yesterday at UCL, actually. So I've been documenting the governance of this disaster recovery, who did what, where, and how, and why, and mainly showing that we have 2 disconnected scales that happen. So at the level of the macro scale, at the level of international actors and the state response, we had very little interventions, a lot of meetings, a lot of talk, a lot of reports that came out, but effectively on the ground we had very little reforms, a few projects that got implemented, some contribution to the removal of debris, some contribution to trying to coordinate the work of NGOs, but effectively the real work was happening by the collective of national NGOs, international NGOs, faith-based organizations, universities and professionals, and political and sectarian groups to a lesser degree. And so we have what I call a complex assemblage of actors that involved large and small actors, international and national ones, old and new, religious and non-religious, sectarian and non-sectarian, universities and research centers like ours, and that really led the recovery. Today, based on our estimates at the Urban Lab, about 80% of the neighborhoods are recovered. It doesn't mean it's a rosy picture. There are lots of exclusion, lots of segregation also that happened, lots of class-based segregation. There's gentrification by the NGOs themselves who inhabit these neighborhoods because they're trendy and it's interesting to live there. So this also raises the price of rent and excludes people from staying there. So of course it's not a rosy picture, but it's still 3 years almost after the blast. There's a recovery that happened, and it didn't happen by the state nor by international organization. It happened by the people of Beirut who organized and mobilized in NGOs and other organizations and recovered the neighborhoods of their city. So it's an interesting example when you think about other episodes of reconstruction in Lebanon. Downtown Beirut was rebuilt by a real estate company thanks to the capital of Rafiq Hariri, who's a billionaire prime minister who was assassinated in 2005. After the 2006 war, Hezbollah rebuilt down the Har Tahrik, the area of Beirut that was razed to the ground by Israelis. So they took the money from aid and rebuilt it in a very top-down manner, manner. This is the first time that there's a reconstruction that happens in Lebanon that is not done by a rich businessman or real estate company or by a political party. So I think it's an interesting lesson to think about how cities can be rebuilt. I show you a few images of the type of involvement. So these are interventions by the faith-based organization that did much more urban and social services, upgrading in small projects in the poorer neighborhoods. What's probably more interesting for urbanists is the type of interventions that were led more by NGOs, INGOs, and the universities, and that we try to push for in the Urban Lab, which are more heritage restoration, open and public spaces that advance this idea of collective living, commons, public space for all, shared spaces, where we try to activate vacancies, where we try to activate public life that can bring people together, an urban recovery rather than just, a physical recovery of buildings, but more of an urban integrated and holistic recovery. So this is Laziza Park is a squat that was further refurbished after the blast. Vendôme stairs are one of the public stairs that are very well known in the areas where a lot of cultural events happen. You can see a little bit here an intervention that was supported by UN Habitat and designed by actually Catalytic Action. And we were talking about the work they do. They're based in London and operate a lot in Beirut. This is a streetscape that the BUL did. This is an existing municipal park that was revived, and the other two pictures are heritage restoration that was done after the blast, where we're hoping to inject cultural activities and community centers as well, to not to leave them as empty, nice buildings, but also to give them a social and cultural life. I think that's it. And I invite you to see the site for more. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Mona. That was absolutely fascinating. How much time do we have for questions? Anyway, so does anyone from the audience want to kick things off with a question for Mona? Anything spark your interest? I don't know, maybe I could start then. So you've done quite a bit, obviously, of work and scholarship, but I was curious, are you considering intervening around public transportation? Just a little background for this, for those of you who know Beirut and for those of you who don't, the city is dominated by vehicles and cars, and I think there's a lot of, the squeeze on space often comes from the need to put cars somewhere. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes, that's a huge problem in the city. So it's a city like a lot of global south cities where the culture of the private car and the private vehicles dominates. Although it changed a bit after the crisis, where people are shifting to motorcycles and walking because gas is very expensive now. So there's a little bit of shift to other modes of transportation, but it's still not what it should be. So we do have organizations that try to advocate for soft mobility, for a public transportation system that's reliable and that's adequate. We do have a semi-public transportation system, the vans of Beirut, that some people and some of our students use to commute, but it's not very reliable. Not everybody's using it. It's not on all the streets. It offers an opportunity for intervention. At the lab, we don't have bandwidth to work on this. We don't have any scholars who are trained in transportation planning and policy, but we work with people who know about this. So usually when we're solicited to respond to this, we call on them and we put them in touch and try to push forth this. So we worked, Waid Al-Harithi specifically worked with the public transportation activists to try to create public transportation routes along these lines that you see in red here. So it's very much part of what we think of. Whenever we think about an inclusive, viable, just city, of course, it starts with soft mobility. It's impossible to think about the city otherwise. If you want to advance public space, there's no other way. It's about removing the private car. But it's really a war that needs to be waged. If we look at other case studies elsewhere, it took very strong and authoritarian mayors to impose pedestrianization and walkability in cities. Our decision makers are not champions of soft mobility. The cartels that rule the private cars and the mafias one of the mafias of the gas and the private car, because they're all linked, and there's a logic through which the private car rules. So the politicians are very much embedded in these mafias and cartels. So they're not going to advocate for something that doesn't advance their interests or the interests of their friends or their cousins. So it's a very difficult battle.
Maybe just on that, could you talk about some of your strategies for advocacy for change, in the sense that you've used the words mafia, you've used cartel, that's a failed state. So to advance sometimes these infrastructure plans, that are very much looking at, needing to look at systems intervention.
Yeah.
How are you able to work with actors that essentially are in controlling of that sort of decision making, and yet are probably have very differing interests than the ones you're trying to advance?
So yes, this is a very difficult question. It's a question that doesn't have a real answer. What is change in a country that's ruled by oligarchs or kleptocrats? Where you don't have an independent judiciary, where impunity rules, where you can hold nobody accountable. How can you even conceive of change? People. I wouldn't say we have a failed state. We have a state that operates as a dysfunctional state, and that does it on purpose. It's very different. The state is there. It arrests every day journalists, activists, people who are speaking truth to power against it, people like me. If this goes online, maybe they will stop me because I'm saying Lebanon is a state ruled by kleptocrats. It can happen. It happened not yet to researchers, but it's a very close thin line. So it's more and more what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Tunisia, what's happened in many authoritarian states that are trying to stifle civil rights and freedom of speech and liberties. So when you are in these conditions, the idea of change is extremely hard. Sometimes, and this is what I tell students and what I tell myself, I think we're in a time where even speaking truth to power is change. And this is how far we can go. And we have to be very careful, because you don't want to risk your life or the life of your family, of the life of your students, and you have to be very cautious with what you can do. So, there are no more protests and uprisings in the streets of Beirut, I think largely because of that, because we did huge uprising in 2019 in every possible city, every possible intersection. It was a textbook revolution. If you want to see what is a revolution, Lebanon would tick all the boxes. And after that, the sectarian system was so strong that it reproduced itself and repressed everyone. The counter-revolutionaries were extremely powerful. The pandemic came and helped as well. And the pandemic helped a lot of autocratic regimes everywhere. So we are in a stage where, in many ways, they won. And talking about change under those conditions is very hard. But one can also see change, like I'm showing you, like all this data production is a form of change. When I was a student, there was nothing like this. I would dream of seeing something like this. So for us, maybe we have to see it as like the production of data, of information. Data is power. Data can lead many intervention, many initiative. And I'm hoping I think we're hoping at the lab to inspire generations of students and activists and future policymakers, future activists, future political opposition groups, political parties, to use this information and to do something with it. And we'll be there to support them and to walk the road that needs to be done, rather than us being the politicians doing it. So we're there like supporting that movement, that journey which exists, which has been repressed and this, I would say, violently stopped in many ways along the way, but that is now maybe retreating strategically. I think we're at a stage where this production of knowledge, of even building a safe space like the Urban Lab for students and activists and researchers to come and to think collectively about change under those conditions, what works, what doesn't. I have a colleague who's an anthropologist who was inviting us to actually dwell in the question, and I really like this invitation. I said that yesterday at UCL as well, because there's always this ask by the audience and by students, like, what can we do? And maybe at this stage in time, with all the monsters coming out, it's a stage of dwelling in the question of, like, what can we do? And I don't think it's an easy question. Let's stay in it, think together about what can be done, and maybe it's about not doing wrongs. I mean, we reflect also of, like, if we should have done this Roland Piazza or not. I mean, every day we have a conversation if we should have engaged in building that stupid extension of a sidewalk that means almost nothing, but that we're being fought against because we're removing car parkings. I mean, the symbolism of this also answers your initial question about how can we give back a city for people who want to walk, for citizens, not for cars. And it's like, no, you won't. We want our 2 cars back. We need to park them where you're building your sidewalk. And it's like a mini project, but it tells you a lot about, you know, where things are at.
Just on that note, I was talking with a friend about parking lots in Beirut, and she just came up, she's like, Louise, she's Lebanese, but don't you know a parking lot means the land's in negotiation? And I was like, so it's a symbol for just that tug of war that Bono was speaking of.
Frederick Weisenborn, I wanted to thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to invite you to just build on the point that you were making just now about political mobilization and whether you see any evidence of increased activity in a political mobilization sense in the aftermath of the blast. I suppose it's particularly interesting what you were saying about the tendency of the system, the political system, to reproduce itself, because there inevitably will be a tendency for it to do so. At the same time, it feels like there is a kind of political vacuum at the moment. I think only this week was the 12th time that there was a failure to actually elect a president. So there is a political vacuum, and I'm just wondering whether, in the same way that you say that the regeneration after the blast is a bottom-up regeneration, unlike the regeneration you had in 2006 and the regeneration that you had in the 90s, whether there is an opportunity for bottom-up political mobilization to move into that political vacuum and actually drive change at a greater scale.
Yeah, thank you for this question. We had elections in 2019, in 2022, just almost a year ago, parliamentary elections that brought the biggest coalition of opposition individuals to parliament. So we had a coalition of 13 individuals who entered our 128-person parliament and who were supposed to form this opposition group. So if you follow what happened since, over the past year, you see the tactics of the sectarian system at co-opting these people, at undermining their attempts at colliding together. And today you see that there's a tendency in parliament where you have the people who are change makers and who believe that that whoever will come as a president today will going to reproduce a sectarian system, like it's like, what do you call it, old wine in new bottles, or new bottles, I mean, one of those. So you have this group, and you have now, I think, 3 individuals who think that we cannot work within the system and we need to radically oppose it. So the short answer is, like, I don't think this is a system that can be I mean, this is a system that's very strong. It has a legacy. I mean, these are warlords that rule, that have been ruling for 30 years. Lebanon never had transitional justice after the civil war. The same militia men who killed each other wore suits and came into parliament, and this was a deal that was brokered in Saudi Arabia under the auspices of all the big powers, the US, France. I don't know if the UK was involved, but it was like a deal that was brokered that brought these people in government. So we're dealing with a political class that's extremely strong, extremely savvy at reproducing itself. They've done it through a lot of conflicts and disasters and the geopolitical changes. And this is what is happening right now as well. Along the way, you also have parties that became much stronger. I'm thinking mainly about Hezbollah, which is now the main hegemonic party that rules the political class. So I'm not seeing possibilities it's so ingrained and so structured that it's extremely hard to think about change through activist work. But yes, there is vacuum. There's a lot of possibilities to create what I called a few years ago cracks in the system. Now, the literature tells us when you have multiple cracks in the system, there might be moments where these cracks coalesce, and I really like this term, and it gives you that sense of like, maybe they'll coalesce at some point. And I think they coalesced in 2019 with the uprising. It was an amazing moment where possibility was there, and where, we really felt that the possibilities of change could happen, and we came together as a nation, and there were real discussions about the legacy of the civil war for the first time in the political history of Lebanon. So this is a moment that is not forgotten. People lived it in their bodies, people experienced it for consecutive days. The memory and the imaginary of these uprisings are extremely strong. There will be another moment. When, how, where will it lead you? It's very hard. I was discussing an amazing book that just came out by Mark Beisinger called The Revolutionary City. And he analyzes 100 years of revolutions in cities across the world. And when you read it, you feel like, oh, okay, of course it won't happen now. It's like revolutions are more failures than successes. Very few of them succeed, and even if revolutionaries take up power, most of the time they inherit a system that's so corrupt, that's so rotten, that they can't even change from within like they hoped they would. And it's demonstrated with quantitative numbers and evidence, so it makes you really see this as like, it's a very long journey. I'm not sure when it will work, and it made, my ambitions become much more pragmatic, and be like, if people who are change makers, who want to work on change, keep on doing what they want to do in their little bubbles, maybe it will coalesce again, maybe there will be a political window that will open up, and some of these people will enter public institutions. Currently in Lebanon, even public officials are resigning. We have empty public agencies. You go, you want to renew your passport, there's nobody there. You want to renew your driving license, they open once a week because they're paid peanuts and they don't want to come to work. So it's a major crisis. And of course, and it's even more than a crisis. It's like the death of the old system, and we have no idea what's going to come up. So it's a very interesting time as an observer, not as a citizen. So when I put my observer hat and I look at this, I'm like, what will come out of this? What's next? It's ripe with possibilities. Yes, I agree. But at the same time, the hegemonic actors are very strong. And the geopolitical changes, Syria, the Syrian regime is now a friend of everybody. It's not, we've normalized all the Syrian massacres. Everybody's receiving Bashar al-Assad. That's not a good sign. Erdogan was re-elected. Geopolitically, it's like an alignment of autocratic regimes that does not seem to be in favor of democracy in Lebanon or elsewhere. So, unfortunately, I'm at a stage in my life where I'm seeing this too clearly. 10, 15 years ago, maybe I would have been more hopeful, but I've been through too many disasters and crises not to be bleak about what's coming. So dark times, I think, for Lebanon for a very long period of time. So people who left with that in mind, and people who are staying behind are holding the fort, hoping for better days, better times, and in many ways they're the few, because it's not easy to survive with everything happening in Beirut these days.
I've got a small and quite boring question about that really rousing reflection on what can be difficult, what might not work even when things are possible, on that we just reach the edge of the possible, but that there's a sort of system inbuilt way in which it might not work. So with all of that thinking and observation, observer hat about the system, the citizen hat, the activist hat, the political hat, do you ever use, and this is the boring bit, do you ever use mapping to micro forecast about systems? So I've seen the use towards, it's because I'm near that. The use towards design, potential briefs, almost using both the data and the potential spatial thinking around when things are ready, when the right politician's in place, when the right funding's in place, how do we socialize this? Do you ever forecast about systems, like this would be the wrong time to do a thing, or here there's going to be a great specific spatial weakness? That's it.
Super interesting. I never thought about this. I think to be able to think about these speculations, you also need to imagine yourself and project yourself in that future. It would be very interesting to do that. I think we need to be prompted to do it. I think we're in a phase in our professionals and personal lives where we're living, we often say we're not even living day by day, we're living half day by half day, because we have no idea what's going to happen today, and something is going to, things always happen in Beirut these days. So I think that projection on that front seems to me like we're not there in our brains or our minds, but I think I would love to think about this with you, or whoever would be interested in thinking about this. I can imagine a very exciting design studio about this, where we can think about our visioning exercises, because the visioning exercises are about that, but they're not about the systems yet. They're more about design possibilities rather than systems possibilities. But absolutely, I think the systems would be a very interesting layer to explore.
I think we're really interested in all the invisible flows that shape space, and the things that are real and built but are considered invisible. And I think based in Beirut and with this work that you've done, you have like an X-ray capacity to accurately speak semi-visible, visible, semi-opaque, built, unbuilt systems and the relation between them. So what that is and whether it's spatially mapped or not, I don't know, but I think there's something there that you're connecting that feels incredibly, you were talking about transnational working, incredibly applicable to how we think about what things we try to make visible or intervene in. And I'd be really excited about these kind of micro futures and how we voice not just the paving arguments and the parking politics, which seems very recognizable from around the world, but some of the HR corridors, the kind of political, Louise did a really interesting board game thinking about all the unspoken, the bribes, the hints, the habits that build up the politics of Beirut in order to then begin thinking about the public-facing intervention. So this would be great. Now I'm going to wave this around. Put your hand up if you want it. I saw yours first.
It's just a tiny question about, thank you, by the way, for the amazing talk. It's so interesting. I was wondering about the informal, and the informal in relation maybe to this diagram, and in relation to the city, and also in relation to it does connect with the political activism that may or may not be rising or growing or active. But how it links in with the NGOs and the FBOs and all of the sort of activity that happens in Beirut to create the governance.
Informal is a keyword in Beirut. Everything is informal. I mean, we have a very active informal economy. We have informal housing. We have a lot of informality, even in dealing and wheeling around things. We have a very active black market that's informal, especially after the devaluation of the pound, the lack of capital controls. So even informal finances that happens. So which part of the informal you're interested in?
I was thinking about the coming together of people informally to create action, I guess. But I suppose in relation to what you're saying, all of the formal entities have an aspect of informality within them, and so operate on those scales.
So in the episodes of Reconstruction, a lot of the NGOs work in informal neighborhoods. So typically spaces that are inhabited by people who don't own their lands or their buildings or are squatting or have some type of informal tenure. And and this is where you have the highest concentration of vulnerable people and marginalized groups, migrants, refugees, queer groups. So these areas are typically, this is the refuge of the city. And a lot of NGOs operate in these parts of the city. And they deal with informal neighborhoods, informal population, and they try to learn from the informal ways of living and working to try to protect them as much as possible when they exist, and allow these livelihoods to sustain. They're the most precarious groups currently and the most invisibilized and the more criminalized currently. There's a very strong narrative against Syrian refugees at the moment in Lebanon as scapegoats to everything that's happening. There's a very strong network of informal production in the city as well. It also happens in rich neighborhoods, so there's a lot of informal and rich neighborhoods, but we don't call it informal. We call it illegal, and then it gets legalized. So there are possibilities to regularize the illegal when it's done by the rich. My colleague Muna Fawaz has a beautiful paper on this, on how the illegality of the rich gets regularized, and it's not called informal, but it's the same processes of informalization. I mean, Beirut and Lebanon are great labs to explode all these categories, the formal, informal, what does it mean? It's always about the hybrid most of the time. It makes you understand that these binaries are not very productive lenses to look at things. And informality in that sense is like a very good one to read the city. I mean, a lot of work can be done on that. Unfortunately, not a lot has been done on it. Thank you for your question. You had something, yes?
Any other questions before I hand it to Krista, then the gentleman, then Alex? Sorry. Oh, sorry. Did you have a question?
Hi, I'm actually from Singapore, and sometimes, like in Singapore, we would, like urban
Of
planning
course.
or urban futures may seem like a really lofty idea. I'm just curious to know about your experience having to co-produce or having the participatory kind of process. And what are the challenges and opportunities in trying to produce the maps or the projects that you have? Yeah.
Yes, we did a lot of participation in the neighborhood of Karantina I mentioned earlier. So my colleague Waid Al-Harisi privileged a participatory approach from the beginning of her interest in intervening in this neighborhood. So just after the blast, because she had worked on citizen science methodologies, which are really participatory planning methodologies, she had worked on those in Aleppo and in Erbil. So she had some experience developing these approaches, and she had good knowledge of how to go about it with residents' community. So they spent a very long time I think about 6 months in the community before starting with any planning. And that was possible because we had a big grant from the Canadian actually that allowed us 3 years to do the work and that funded the citizen science approach. So we started with socioeconomic needs assessment. We started with a basic survey. After we had identified the community, introduced ourselves and told them that we'd like to work with you and come up with ideas for interventions that can suit you on open spaces, because this is what we are able to do, and we have access to the municipality and we can help do these things together. And we identified people in the community who we hired as citizen scientists. So there were 12 citizen scientists from the community, from the different neighborhoods, the sub-neighborhoods of that community. They included non-Lebanese as well, because the community included Syrians and Kurdish people, I believe. So we had also representatives from the Syrian and the Kurdish community who lived in also clusters, so they were clustered in buildings and parts of the neighborhood, and they became the citizen scientists of the project. So they accompanied the project from the very first months, and we did a lot of community meetings. We trained them on planning and drawing and map reading and map production. So they were able to take part in the workshops we organized, where we did ideation together on what is it that they miss having in the open spaces. We mapped all their spatial practices, of course, and so we identified the areas where the children play, where the elderly sit, where women meet, the temporalities of the day, because we're also in a neighborhood where things develop, change between the day and the night, between weekday and weekends, between when the women are outside in the public sphere and when men come from work in the afternoon and they retreat back in their homes, and children who play under the eyes of their mothers who see them from the windows. So we were able to identify all these dynamics that explain how the open and public spaces are being used but with no infrastructure. And what we did is provide that actually very micro infrastructure for the kids to play in ways that are more imagined and more creative for them. And we did that in partnership with a lot of organizations who had funding to do playgrounds or plant trees and produce shade and produce shading devices. I wished I had the photos, but we have nice photos of the before and after. So this experience in Quarantine, I think Huwaida just published a paper on it. It's coming out very soon. So I'll be happy to share it with you and you can circulate it. So that documents that process. It was a relative, I think it is a success story. It's hard to say it's a success story when you're part of it, but I think it is a success story.
Thank you so much, Mona, for an amazing presentation. And it's amazing to see the work that you're doing and to have you talking about it here. You've spoken a lot about anecdotes of restrictions on freedom of speech and conflicts or restrictions on the projects. And please do fight against those 2 bloody cars, because it's really, really important. But do you face or fear facing larger scale restrictions on the kind of critical voice of the work that you do as a lab? And how do you deal with that precarity?
Yeah. Well, having traveled in the Arab world, I think Lebanon is still a place where freedom of speech exists. And I think so far, one of the issues in Lebanon is like when I was younger and I used to, before reading the news on my phone, and I used to open the newspaper, I used to see a scandal after another. I would say like, oh, they're going to imprison this guy. Look what they said he did, and nothing would happen. So it took me a while to understand that we have a freedom of speech in Beirut and Lebanon. We talk a lot about corruption and scandals, but we have also a very politicized judiciary, no accountability, and a lot of impunity. So you can talk what you want, but it doesn't mean it's going to lead to sanctions or to consequences. So the lab operates with that too. There's an allowance of speaking and publishing and talking I mean, even when I did my PhD on Hezbollah, before Hezbollah was on the list of sanctions, I published papers that say Hezbollah is providing services in a clientelistic way that advances its interest. And as a good PhD scholar, when I published the paper, I took it and I gave it to the people I interviewed. And I said, thank you very much. This is the paper. If you'd like to read it, give me any comments, let me know. And I was like very scared. What are they going to say? I'm not saying nice things about these guys, and these guys are powerful, and I don't know what they're going to do. And nothing happened. And then I discovered later that they are making copies of my paper and giving it to people who visit them, telling them like, oh, we have researchers who did work on us and see what she's written. And I'm like, guys, I'm not saying good things about you. Did you read it? And I don't think they've read it. They would have never distributed if they've read it. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm another scholar producing things that nobody reads. And like, I'm not sure what academia is used for, but whatever, I did that part. So my experience has been like, I can speak all I want, nothing is going to happen. And we get invited to a lot of forums and we say what we're just saying here to the World Bank, to UN Habitat, to our ministers and to our Prime Minister. I mean, we're at a stage in the lab where we're inviting to high-level meetings and we're able to speak directly to the decision makers and policy makers, and this is great. I mean, this is a premiere. We've never done that before. We used to go and speak to the Director General or to the aide of the minister, but now we're like, we want you to go and speak about your vision of the port with the World Bank, who's doing the master plan for the port, and with the Prime Minister. And we go and we speak, and we're like, we tell them, soft mobility, walkability, remove the cars, protect the migrants. These are important people. We say everything we say here, but you know, we have 5 minutes, so we need to pitch very quickly. So we learned how to pitch very quickly, key messages to come across, and they come and shake our hands and tell us, this is great, thank you very much. Nothing happens. So this is more our experience, and this is where we're like, it's also about, I think it's a strategy of also co-opting us, telling like, we spoke with the Urban Lab people, we ticked that. So we did engage with civil society because we're categorized as a civil society group. We did that, and yes, we heard them, and nothing happens. So at some point you feel like you're tokens. We become the expert token that, and so you're not very sure anymore if you should do it, if you should go to the meeting or boycott the meeting, or go and be harsher or be unhappy. So it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one to be the expert in a dysfunctional state ruled by corrupt, and where, I mean, the aid people are not, I mean, sorry Louise, but the aid industry is also part of this machine, and I mean, it has been, it's not easy, but there are good aid people. I mean, good staff in aid agencies, and they're very unhappy with all this inertia as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona. I hope you guys enjoyed this talk, and she definitely further inspired me on Beirut. Also captured the reason why I find that city, as maddening as it is something that deserves a lot of love. So I hope maybe this will, you know, yeah, this will inspire a little bit of curiosity. Anyway, thank you very much, and oh, and we want a picture. We have plenty of pictures.